here to talk about one of my favorite things, which is Southern socialism. And I'm very excited to be joined by our guest, Kelsey. Kelsey, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey y'all. My name is Kelsea Bond. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm running for Atlanta City Council District 2.
Well, it's really exciting, and it's really important, I think, to kind of continue on the momentum after the Mamdani campaign. And I'm just curious about, for people who might not be as familiar with Atlanta, what are the major issues, and specifically, what got you into running here?
Sure. So I've been an organizer on the ground in Atlanta for over 5 years now. I joined during the COVID-19 pandemic, shortly after Bernie dropped out of the race and Black Lives Matter protests exploded across the country. And I kind of had this realization how all these issues intersect, and an understanding that I had to get involved on the day-to-day level in order to change the society that we live in and take our country in a new trajectory. And so I have been a labor organizer in Atlanta for several years, been an active member of the Democratic Socialists of America. And, we've seen so many different fights in Atlanta over these last few years, including Stop Cop City, the fight to build light rail on the Beltline in Atlanta. We've seen an unprecedented amount of lack of respect for democracy in Atlanta politics. And I think this has really fired up the progressive left to, elect people who are ready to fight the status quo, refuse corporate money, and, find a new way to do politics in Atlanta.
Yeah, well, I'm curious, to hear your thoughts on this, because Atlanta has been a kind of national news story with its, grassroots organizing, particularly in the fight around Cop City, right, which is a very important fight, obviously. But there's been a lot of really exciting things happening on the political front, right, with getting candidates elected, correct?
Yeah, so this last November, our DSA chapter had our first success electing Gabriel Sanchez to the Georgia State House District 42. He will be the first DSA endorsed elected in the state legislature. Technically, you could argue Julian Bond was the first socialist in the state legislature back in the day. But this was a big victory for us. It was an entirely grassroots campaign. He also refused corporate money. We beat a 7-year incumbent who took loads of corporate money. We were outraised, I think, times 2, but we ended up knocking 17,000 doors up in Smyrna, Cobb County, Georgia, which is historically one of the more red-leaning suburbs of Atlanta. And there's been demographic change in recent years, and we just tapped into that and talked to people about the issues that mattered to them.
Yeah, it's been very exciting kind of watching what's been happening in Georgia and across the South. And I'm curious on that. That's not your stump speech. What are you talking to when you're talking to folks about?
Yeah, so I'm running in District 2, which is the smallest, densest district in Atlanta. It's half renter. It's very young, very progressive district. A lot of people there signed the petition to put Cop City on the ballot. And rent in Atlanta has increased so much these last few years. Since 2019, rent has increased 36%, and it's even worse for homeowners. The cost of purchasing a home has gone up more 60-70%. And so, this is pushing people out of the district, this is pushing people out of Atlanta, and we have seen no meaningful interventions in our city housing policy. And obviously we do have preemptions on the state level. We're in a red state, which makes it all the more challenging. So we are largely talking about the cost of housing on doors, but also expanding public transit, because Atlanta is such a car-dependent city. Every year we see new levels of record heat. I don't call it hot Atlanta. Natives don't call it that, but it's extremely hot and it's unsustainable. And, we're running on winning a Green New Deal for Atlanta and, a different way of operating.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because I'd like to sort of take the Green New Deal down from the slogan to what that really means.
Yeah. So Atlanta is a city with a huge amount of sprawl, right? And we have, antiquated zoning laws, which make it hard to build anything but single family homes, which is really on an environmental level and an affordability level unsustainable, right? Atlanta's not walkable. Compared to a city like Chicago or New York, half our streets don't even have sidewalks. So in practice, Green New Deal for Atlanta means planning our neighborhoods with intention so that they're walkable, bikeable, transit friendly, and that we have the housing density to actually support transit expansion, which has been, a real inhibition to us doing that because Metro Atlanta has so much sprawl.
And I'm curious, and forgive me if this is kind of a non sequitur, but I know, like in Texas, one of the things that's been very difficult when it comes for us to build trains has been like the opposition of like the major airlines. And I'm curious if that's the case in Atlanta. Maybe not so much because Texas is such a sprawling state. So,
I don't know about airlines, but there has in recent years been opposition to plans to building light rail around the walking trail in Atlanta called the Beltline. These plans were meant to start specifically in my district on the east side of the trail. And there's been this kind of astroturfed anti-transit group known as Better Atlanta Transit, which has been coordinating opposition to the rail, spreading a lot of misinformation about it. And it's mostly backed by, businesses and corporations located on the Beltline that are afraid of losing that tourism traffic. I've also heard that Lime Scooter is somewhat involved.
Interesting.
On the lobbying side, but I don't know about airplanes.
Well, on that, I mean, let's talk a little bit about like affordability and like what the working class message is here, right? Because I feel like there really isn't a city in the U.S. that we can talk about that's not going through an affordability crisis. And, I think it's important to, one, be able to talk about the problems, but also help people understand like what is kind of possible in politics, because cities feel very limited in being able to deal with a lot of these things. Yeah.
It's hard without federal intervention, and we're certainly not going to see federal money towards affordable housing these next 4 years. So it is difficult, but the mayor has spoken to solutions like social housing, like community land trusts, and yet we're not acting on any of those solutions. And so, I'm running to actually say, let's try a different way of doing it, because it's pretty clear that letting the free market do its thing on housing is just not providing the housing we need for actually low-income Atlantans.
Well, we're here at the DSA convention, and I want to talk a little bit about, your relationship with DSA. And talk about your relationship with DSA, and then maybe for people who are watching this who don't know DSA, are unaffiliated, why this organization is so important for getting these kind of policy goals in place.
So DSA is the largest socialist organization in the country. There's chapters, I think, in nearly every state. And so I'm actually the former co-chair of the Atlanta chapter. I was co-chair for around 4 years. Very involved in our electoral and labor organizing, and really, building the chapter's relationships with local unions like Starbucks Workers United, the Teamsters, the Painters Union, et cetera. And I think our local chapter has around 1,000 members. And so we played a very big role in electing Gabriel Sanchez to the Georgia State House last fall. And, our way of organizing elections is so hugely different from the way that the Democratic Party establishment organizes elections. We don't take corporate money. We rely on solely small dollar grassroots fundraising. And, we have members who really care about, charting a new political path forward, shaping our society and our government. And so, our campaigns, mine and Gabriel Sanchez's relied on, grassroots volunteers who came out and knocked doors every weekend, knocking tens of thousands of doors, meeting voters where they're really at, pulling those people into the democratic process who feel disillusioned with our political system. And, we kind of have this understanding, to change our political system and to beat this corporate establishment and corporate politics, we need regular working people involved in the fight, in the hundreds and the thousands and eventually the millions. So,
well, I mean, on that, I'm curious, as a politician, somebody running for office, I'd be curious in your general thoughts on this too, if you have any. But what's the relationship between kind of a movement politician and the movement, right? And how functionally can we kind of set up those kind of strong connections?
Yeah, that is a great. So we are kind of experimenting with this right now in Atlanta DSA, because Gabriel is our first, endorsed elected official who won. So we have a Socialist in Office committee that kind of manages that relationship between him and the chapter, making sure that we have an open line of communication, that we're making decisions together on, priorities, how to vote. And, the way that DSA elected officials operate differently from the average politician is that we have these deep connections to the movement, and not just to DSA, but other community organizations as well, to labor unions. I'm a former union member. And so, I have been kind of communicating with not just DSA, but other organizations I've worked with in Atlanta that, I want to run as a movement candidate who's uplifting these movement demands, who's working alongside the community and even acting as this kind of voice for the organizing that's happening on the ground, because I understand that I will not have any power in City Hall without active coordination with these people who are actually doing the work in the community, on the shop floor, and making sure that we are, not isolating ourselves from what's actually happening in the movement.
Yeah, and I also would just add that I think one of the things that can be really helpful too is when you're in power, when you're somebody who's privy to things that other people aren't as privy to, being able to kind of share information and insight about who are the power players, not just in the sense of the ones that folks know, but who ends up having influence, how things get done, that kind of behind the scenes thing.
Baseball. Yeah, and I mean, on a personal level, I've lived in Atlanta my whole life, and I've been disappointed by progressives who got elected to local office. And so the way that I'm running my campaign is shaped by watching others do it and fail, honestly. And, having this analysis of they were not backed by the movement. And so it's really easy when you get in there to, receive peer pressure from your peers, from donors. And so what DSA is really trying to do is build this independent political establishment that is truly independent and not reliant on these same donors and on these same, elite peer connections that are pressuring people to make these bad decisions in office ultimately.
No, I think that's really important. Well, in the last couple of minutes, broadening out a little bit, we're both Southerners, and we both are sort of contending with difficult political situations, at least on the state and now the national level. How can a lot of times people feel very disillusioned with politics? They feel particularly local and city is just well, what can we do? The state governments are honestly throwing out the books, pushing into the gray area of the law, sometimes, on purpose, sometimes just because they're feel very emboldened. How can we, people who are living in quote unquote red states or in the South, kind of think about, local citywide politics as a way to affect change when it seems like the deck is so stacked against working class politics? Yeah,
I mean, something that's been, again, having lived in a red state my whole life, it's really easy to feel like there's no way out of this, right? And I think, there certainly a segment of the population that's just waiting for Georgia to flip blue. And of course, I hope that happens too, right? I would like to gain my abortion rights back, right? But at the same time, we can't just rely on that. And when I've talked to people who work in politics, who are already politicians, I think there's this tendency on the municipal level to just throw your hands up and say, well, this is preempted at the state level. There's nothing we can do about it. This is out of our hands. This is a job for the county or the state. And I think we are leaving a lot of power on the table when we do that. And, we are elected to serve the interests of working people who got us elected. And, there's been, that's why I think DSA is interested in building power specifically, and not just rely on, reforms and legislation when we're in there, but actually building that political power on the outside, so that we can, really push back on these Republican bullies, these corporate bullies who are pulling all the strings in Atlanta right now. Because, Cop City was an active collaboration between the mayor of Atlanta and Brian Kemp. And so when they say, oh, our hands are tied, the Republicans, aren't allowing us to do our jobs, it's no, it's active collaboration because, these corporate Democrats in Atlanta, they have the same exact donors as Brian Kemp and the Georgia State Republicans. And so one thing running for municipal office has really taught me is how similar these, people really are. They're operating in the same class, right? And the more that you zoom in on local politics, it's very hard to tell Republicans and Democrats apart, which is, again, why, I think it's so important for groups like DSA to chart our own political path, refuse corporate donations, and completely, build political independence from these systems that have made the Atlanta way operate the way it has.
Well, the last thing I want to ask you before we go, you're from Atlanta, and Atlanta, like a lot of other places in the South, right, we're experiencing these massive population booms and shifts, right? And a lot of times when they talk about, oh, these states are going to go blue, it's always sort of oh, well, all of these Northerners or people from California are moving out there, they're going to change the politics. How do you think about that? And also, what do you think is the importance, if there is any, in being rooted in a political or historical tradition?
Yeah, I think it's really dangerous on the one hand to assume Georgia will flip blue. And, you know, the Democrats have been taking working class voters, black voters for granted for decades without really talking about the issues that matter to the working class. And we've seen this in, you know, shifts in voting patterns. And so, again, this is why we have to really meet voters where they're at, talk about economic issues that are really being ignored by the Democratic Party, and, you know, bringing people into the democratic process when we do get elected so they feel heard and they feel like their representatives are actually standing up for them. And so, you know, we're going to have to work really hard to regain those votes in Georgia, and, you know, go out of our way to do so. And so, you know, the Democrats' assumption that we're destined to flip Georgia blue is just...
No, I mean, I think it frankly is really dangerous. I mean, and I think, you know, I think Georgia's a good example of this. Texas is a horrendous example of this, where like for decades now they've just been sort of hoping that the population changes were going to win, and it's worse now. It's getting worse, not better. So well,
we change.
Well, you know, I think that, you know, this campaign's really exciting, and hopefully we'll be able to make it better. Thank you so much for joining us. And you know, how can people keep up with the campaign?
So you can check out my website, KelseyBond.com. It's spelled KelseaBond.com. Very active on Instagram, of course. All the donations we can get, the better. And if you have friends in Atlanta who live in the Midtown area, tell them to vote Kelsey Bond this November.
Well, see. Well, thank you very much, Kelsey.
Thank you.